Welcome to Smart Talk, a series of interviews with world-leading economists and thinkers. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Marty Rowland, a member of the Board of Directors of the Henry George School of Social Science. Marty is a well-known Georgist ecologist. He is now part of an endeavor to establish new engineering standards to support infrastructure development in the United States. Today we will discuss that standards effort along with other initiatives of Marty's. Dr. Rowland has over 40 years' experience in the fields of civil and environmental engineering. I'm Andrew Mazzone, president of the Henry George School of Social Science, and this is Smart Talk. As part of the work we do at the Henry George School and Foundation, environmental issues are becoming more and more our purview. I mean, as classic Georgists, yes, we're interested in the economy, but we're also interested in the environment and all of its attendant issues. And we just so happen to have a board member who's an expert on the environment, and we're going to introduce him now, Dr. Marty Rowland, who's going to tell you about himself and some of the work he's doing and some of the work we've got an interest in. And Marty, to you.
Well, thanks, Andrew. I'd like to introduce myself to people who are not familiar with me and my background. My doctorate is in urban studies. Essentially, it was natural resource economy. I was mentored by Daniel W. Bromley from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. He's now retired, but learning about the commons and the economy of the commons is something of expertise that I have. I'm a professional engineer in civil environmental engineering, and some of the interesting things that I've been doing most recently is I've been involved in the standards setting organization called ASTM, stands for American Society of Testing Materials. So I'm working on this ASTM standard called Public Infrastructure Management, and I've had an exciting opportunity that's coming up next week. A person that's on the committee helping me to write this standard is also in the Asset Leadership Network, and they have a conference in Washington, D.C., and I've been asked to lead a panel on decision making in asset management, infrastructure of that sort. And the thing that's exciting is that at the end of the conference, there's going to be a white paper written, and it's going to be given to Congress and the two candidates for President of the United States, essentially telling them, hey, implement this. And I think there's a great opportunity for me and ASTM because the standard that I'm writing goes into the, what I call them 15 types of infrastructure. And it includes things such as nature. And that kind of gets back to the environmental aspect of my expertise. But within the standard, there's this opportunity for public executives who would be the ones using this guide to look at where the money's coming from for the various things that you need for like water and sewer and education and buildings and such. But it always asks that question when you're done with the analysis, have you thought about land value capture before you decide not to do something? So I'm always providing that opportunity to promote Georgism and Georgist thought within what I'm doing.
How would you value, for example, a particular ASTM standard? I'm familiar with the ASTM, and usually it's a product or a function or a process that they're delineating. But in your case, would you be specifying standards for, let's say, bridges generically, or specific bridges, for example?
Well, the way it's been described to me is that it was Andrew Carnegie who created the first ASTM standard. Of course, it wasn't ASTM when he did it, but essentially he had trouble getting the consistent quality of steel for his railroads.
Okay.
So he said to the steelmen, take this recipe, and if you do it right, I'll buy your stuff. So that's the idea behind it. Recipes, doing it in a consistent manner. In the 90s, environmental professionals came together, and they saw a need for a standard way of doing property assessments. So nowadays, everybody's familiar with, oh, I'm going to buy a house. So does this house have lead or asbestos? Is there contamination? So one of the first environmental ASTM standard was the phase 1, phase 2 environmental assessments.
I see.
So, yeah, so that's essentially how that came about. And then with me being in the ASTM and my interest in the environment, infrastructure, and Georgist economics, I'm creating this public infrastructure management.
But again, is it an all-encompassing standard, or do you get to the particulars like roads and and bridges and aquifers management? I mean, how extensive is this standard?
Well, the standard goes into the 15 types of infrastructure, and I start off with potable water, and I get into stormwater and sewage, education, buildings, cultural artifacts, parks and recreation. I include nature and financial services, so it's really the whole ball of wax in terms of anything that you might find in a city is included in this standard. In order to make it manageable, is that I'm not having it be a requirement that any city that picks it up and uses it has to track every type of infrastructure. It's kind of like dipping your toe into the water to see if it's something that you want to do. A city might pick up on one standard. For example, in Flint, maybe the mayor would be focused on potable water, like where is the water coming from? Do we have all the fixtures that we need so that we don't have any lead poisoned water? That kind of thing. Or maybe Ferguson, Missouri, they might pick up and focus on the police and security. How do we go about managing instances of crime and social justice, in an effective way? The main thing that I'm trying to do in the standard is to question that idea that, well, we don't have enough money, so let's don't do something. Our schools are terrible, but we can't raise taxes. So I'm always throwing that option in there. Have you thought about land value capture?
Well, for example, the Ferguson example, where you're challenging Ferguson to build a up-to-date police force. Land value taxation, for example, would be a difficult thing to apply specifically to that particular function. I would think, how would you have managed that? How would you have described the funding of that process, for example?
Well, for example, in the Ferguson example, there's an adjacent town that derives 40% of its operating funds by running a debtor's prison scheme where you arrest people, they can't get out, so they take out loans, they essentially keeping people in jail, so they have to bail themselves out. So that's a thing that I think most civilized people would be against. So in terms of how you would get the funds, it's pretty well known, at least in New York City, that there's so much vacant land that could be taxed that isn't. New York City has at least $1 billion a year that they could raise just on that. I think one of the problems, for example, in Ferguson is there enough land value that hasn't been taxed that you could find something additional? I guess I don't necessarily see land value capture as a panacea everywhere.
Okay.
What I'm trying to do in the standard, though, is force public executives to be accountable and transparent on what they do provide in terms of services and consider various options for raising the revenue.
How thick is your standard? As
Right now, I don't think it's going to be more than like 40 pages. Uh, the thing that I haven't implemented yet is coming up with a scoring system that people would find useful and handy. I'll give you an example of what I'm thinking about right now when I'm talking about education. I wouldn't put down like standardized scores, for example. I might do something like look at attendance or graduation or things of that sort that gives you a handle on whether the funds are being spent correctly, or maybe we need to boost it up a little bit. Coming out with a new standard, I don't want to put a lot of impediments and make it terrifically complicated so that it doesn't get used.
but if it's too general, it's going to be useless. If it's so general that it's not a guide. ASTM standards usually are pretty precise, and they're called specifications for a reason. It's almost the recipe that you would follow. If you're commenting on education in general, that has a multiplicity of modes and aspects to it that to assess the funding needs is a difficult project in and of itself. And where you would get those funding needs filled is also a complex problem.
Where my forte is in the environment and nature, and I guess I'd like to talk about that for a second.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I'm identifying nature as infrastructure, and it's kind of like a different way of thinking.
I think that's fair. That's fair.
But the way I'm looking at it is, for example, when you have wilderness areas, sometimes the best thing to do is just to step back and do nothing. So the expenditure for Yellowstone maybe would be pretty low compared to, say, Central Park. Maybe you'd have to spend quite a bit of more money because there you have nature that has a high reliability angle to it. So something as dangerous as trees falling or branches coming off of trees after a windstorm, that's a pretty big factor in Central Park.
On your stand, the one that the area that you worked on that you feel has the most merit or the most interest or the most need, is there a particular area, whether it be water or something like that, that you find has real cachet with public managers, executives, and those people?
Well, I did publish a standard, a committee, and myself, several people got together, and we published a guide that was in April called Beneficial Use of Landfills and Chemically Impacted Sites.
Okay.
Kind of a interesting title, but essentially one of the problems that I saw in an urban environment was that if a mother asks a city worker, how do I know that that land over there is safe for my kid? And in my experience, the answer was, well, we don't know, or I think it is, things of that sort. So when I wrote this guide and with my committee, I made it looking forward. So it was a matter of identifying the various uses for land, typically in an urban environment, from active recreation, passive recreation. You might have a community garden. You might have a buffer area around an area, but essentially it identifies a process of looking at historic data, looking at old maps of what kind of manufacturing was in certain areas. So they could have an idea of what the risk might be. So the thing that makes it different than what was available before that guide was that an environmental professional would put his name down on the line saying, I looked into it, I've tested it if necessary, and therefore, with the signature, I'm saying that that site is safe and reasonable for use of a certain type. So I'm hoping that that guide gets more use throughout the U.S., maybe internationally, but sometimes it's a process that it takes.
How far along are you with the standards with ASTM, and when would some of those be published?
Well, the one that I'm working on public infrastructure management, we're looking at a year from now, like October 2017.
Okay. Are you looking at the state of the existing infrastructure? There's lots of studies on where we are in terms of infrastructure need. Are you looking at that? And have you made a projection of how much money it would take to bring our infrastructure up to a standard as described by yourself, through ASTM?
Well, the only organization that's stepped up and did something like that is the American Society of Civil Engineers. One of the things that I see with this guide that has a larger use is making it so that people start understanding that having a well-running city, for example, or well managed, where the public services are good and people are satisfied, that's a better guide or a better gauge of how an economy is working than, for example, GDP. You talk to any economist, they're saying, GDP isn't that accurate a measure of the health of the economy, but that's all we have. I'd like to have it so that we look at the state of our infrastructure and the quality of the services that we get, and have that be the gauge for an economy. I think that as public executives are challenged to provide the services that we need, that people will demand a closer accountability.
Okay, but let's take, for instance, a New York City with its tremendous land value, as opposed to a city like Bridgeport, Connecticut, which isn't nowhere near the size nor the profitability of New York City. How would you judge the amount of money that can be captured by, let's say, land value taxation that's available for, let's say, a Bridgeport, and would that money be available enough to fix Bridgeport up to modern standards? If it's a dying city, let's say, then the chances are there's not going to be enough value in the land to fix the city and to run the city and all of that. Whereas New York City, being relatively wealthy compared to most other cities because it has a component of foreign money coming in here, there's so many people who want to be here, so many activities, that you can make a case for land value capture here simply because of the health of the city and infrastructure. Fixing the infrastructure would really pay off. But smaller towns and cities that don't have the value generating capability, but yet would have a need, I mean, just from a human point of view, how do you balance, satisfying the needs of the citizens of a particular city, state, against the ability to actually raise the money? And how do you allocate what money they can raise? And where would the priorities be set on infrastructure?
I think you're bringing up a good point that should be taken up for a doctoral thesis in terms of identifying that threshold of where land value capture is possible. When you look at a city like Detroit, or you're talking about Bridgeport, Connecticut, there's got to be a certain level of activity that you can tap into. Because the thing about land value capture, and maybe people aren't that aware of the feasibility of implementing, is that it's never meant to be detrimental or even found to be burdensome. The idea is that you provide the city services and people are satisfied and they love to be there. So they're essentially thankful that they got these things and they don't mind paying the cost for the provision. So one of the things that New York City, for example, the way I would go in New York City, as opposed to these other ones that maybe haven't reached that threshold, and I don't know what that threshold is, but the vacant land is kind of like a no-brainer, where there's nothing on it, and the question is, why should we not tax that person that's doing nothing but speculating? That's the perfect way of generating a land value capture system. Yeah, and if you do that first, then you kind of whetted people's appetite, saying, well, if you can do that, where else can we move? So I think there's a sequence for like New York City. You do the one thing, then there's a justification for moving on to a more complicated system.
Take the taxation of vacant land. Who in New York City and what area and what aspect would have first claim on that particular pool of money? It's obvious it's there, and let's say you specify it's for infrastructure. Whose infrastructure? Where? Queens, Brooklyn, Manhattan. How do you adjudicate that?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a political question. I think anybody who's going into it and comes up with a plan should have a pretty good idea of where that $1 billion, for example, would justifiably go to. You could divide it up in a billion ways, and then you got $1 for each thing. But I think the way to do it would be to what's feasible, and if the figure is $1 billion, come up with what's not being done now, and what's the biggest bang for the buck if we put it here or there. I think there should always be this idea of investing so that the land values increase. So, what you're doing essentially with the vacant land is assessing it at the use value that it should be there. And if the people owning it right now aren't moving in that direction, the city takes it over and encourages, a valid use or a useful use. But I think, it would be contentious, but I think if people are looking for the benefit of the city.
In terms of land value, activity always precedes land value. In other words, land value is not magic in itself, that a correct land policy will also all of a sudden generate spontaneously activities. There's a certain amount of that in a city that's already built up. But by and large, if you want to find out how much land value there is in a country, the GNP is almost a perfect proxy. The value of the GNP almost equates to the value of land in any capitalist society. So that in New York City, the GNP is approximately $1 trillion if you take all 5 boroughs. And various studies have shown that the value of the land, like the GNP specifically in Manhattan, is $1 trillion. And the value, with some close studies of value in Manhattan, is $1 trillion. There's that much value. Now, if you looked at that and said, okay, we can capture this, that means you probably have to eliminate income tax, all kinds of other taxes to use that pool of value. So that you just can't do that and then give people an income tax, a city tax, a state tax, a sales tax, and all of that. So you'd have to adjudicate that trade-off. And then once you have that, then it's probably going to give you a robust and powerful city. And then you'd have to then decide what infrastructure changes might enhance the activity potential of the city. And that's an economic study in addition to an engineering study. And then and only then can you probably then say, okay, this activity has a value, and we're missing an activity that would give us X amount of value. So you could probably map out a city in terms of what its value coming in should be in terms of the land value tax, and what needs are left unmet that would enhance that. And that would pretty well suggest some of the things you might do. And that could be water, it could be access, it could be roads, it could be, the sanitation, collection, it could be the parking, system itself in the city for traffic flow. And so I think there is a model that you could use to start. Where's the money coming from? What's the activity that's generating that money? And then reallocate that money to enhance the infrastructure that would support and further push more activity. Um, so, any comments on that as a general analytical proposition?
No, I think that's very good insight. I'm hoping that maybe some millennials are watching who can come up with a various you know app or some computer system that can track all the options that we have out there. Because I think it's not going to be done piecemeal. It's going to have to look at all those factors that you just mentioned. But there's got to be a scenario or some game plan where you say, if we do it this way, what's the result? This way, another result. Because right now, there's just a hodgepodge of let's tax this, let's tax soda pop, and maybe we can get something.
Right.
You know, there's got to be something that's directly related. And if you're, it doesn't have to be one to one, but you know, the city has this opportunity to generate the revenue, and you know, we've got a lot of things that we need to improve and provide the opportunities to advance. You know,
Okay, but then let's go back to your white paper for the incoming president and members of Congress. Obviously, you have to deliver some precision to make an impact. And you not only have to deliver precision in terms of the specific things you want done, but how much money they would cost. And so I'm asking you this: how are you making the decision to pick the projects today for that white paper?
well, I guess what I guess maybe I'd like to do is I'm not really sure what they had in mind for the white paper, but I have taken a stab at writing an executive order for the president to organize his troops, so to speak, on asset management, which could lead to some positive. In fact, I think the white paper was their original idea for let's get serious, let's do something that's effective, and say, here, go do it. But if we come up with an executive order that perhaps if we write it well enough that he can issue it, and there's kind of like a game plan already set. So what I did was I found an executive order that Barack Obama had signed in June, and I'm just kind of studying it, how the format is. But I think that what needs to happen is like the Office of Management Budget, which interestingly reports to the Vice President. There's certain things I'm learning about this, but essentially looking at how can the federal government aid in the funding and improving the effectiveness of the various infrastructure types. I think there's a lot of wealth that could be directed in effective ways. I guess the importance of my ASTM standard is that people who are cities that do implement various measures of infrastructure assessment, that might be the criteria for them getting additional funds. For example, if we can get the next administration on board with asset management infrastructure, it would be a real plum for me if my standard was used as the basis for entry into cities gaining that money. So that's kind of the ideas that I'm getting at right now, and I like to think big because, like the American Society of Civil Engineers says, we need the $3.6 trillion, and they're not even looking at all the types of infrastructure that I think is important.
What if you wrote a standard that instructed all of the, let's say, city jurisdictions in the United States to write white papers on what their perceived needs are in terms of infrastructure and how they think they would come up with the revenues to pay for it, And that would be grist for a national plan that would balance areas and regions in an orderly way. I mean, obviously people are going to overshoot, undershoot, or ask for for boondoggle projects that wouldn't really add value. But you would see everybody's thinking, and it will probably have a good approximation, especially if it was city managers, of some of the real felt needs that they would have in terms of infrastructure. And then you probably could get a tractable view of the overall need for the country, and you have a view of what the available resources might be, and then you could decide other methods of fundraising to tackle that, whether it's a bond issue backed by a value-added tax of a national sort. So it would seem to me that you would need an orderly matrix covering the points I said as your first standard. In other words, we would call it whether it be national, regional, state, or city, an assessment standard, and then an estimation of value available to pay for it, even if it isn't in the manager's unconscious of land value, to see what they have to say, and then that plan is recalibrated in given their actual earnings potential, what their needs are, and what they could capture without disrupting and over-determining a city or state in terms of white elephant projects that don't bring anything. Because they'll bring one thing, they'll bring employment at least for a short period of time, and that would kick off and jumpstart further spending in a Keynesian mode, but the end point may not be valid or useful over a long period of time. So it seems to me you've got the germ of an idea that could be very powerful. But I would say in the beginning, it would be more of a taxonomy of projects and revenues as perceived by the people on the ground. And then and only then could you iterate and clean up that plan until it approaches something that's actually feasible. Just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's very good. That's good insight. In the standard that I'm writing, I have an annual period where you go through that process, and then you reassess of where did we fall down the previous year, and we look at various opportunities. But I think one of the things you call them white elephants in the civil engineering world, we call them bridges to nowhere. Where you have these port projects in Congress where congressmen have a certain amount of money they can dedicate stuff that whether we need it or not. But the point that you made was, let's look at a regional basis. Where do we need to go? And maybe let's don't call it pork, but maybe that portion of that would fit into that regional plan might be the basis for okay, well let's develop various regions, and so rather than just having the pork bill that may not necessarily be connected to anything, let's make it connected to a purpose that we're going to look for. One of the things that I think is important is throughout the world, especially in China and Japan, there's high-speed rail. That's a perfect example where you can capture land value, where you have new uses, transportation corridors, and you create new cities. Well, it's a great opportunity to have land value capture right off the bat.
And it's certainly not local. It's regional or national. So that any of the things you're talking about, given the kind of interdependent world we have now, it's not small town America anymore, or even small state America. You almost have to have a regional look at that kind of infrastructure and use of new technology. So perhaps your standard could look at the United States as 12 major regions that economically can use infrastructure scale-ups to enhance value and create increased values, which can then pay for that project. So I think you have to, in my opinion, you have to look at it as a congealed theme, and region certainly is the minimal way you can look at this kind of infrastructure change or enhancement.
Yeah, I have a couple cities that I'm looking to be the pilot. So maybe that'd be the first stab at it. But I agree that looking at a regional basis might make it more feasible, especially on a national basis. And if we're going to be putting together an executive order for the next president to implement something like this, maybe that could be in the policy statement that we find that this is an effective way of identifying and promoting infrastructure.
Maybe the president's executive order should be an instruction to analyze needs on a somewhat collective basis. That people in certain cities and related cities look at themselves at particular regions. Perhaps the president could say, "This is region 1, 2, 3, and 4," and that the people in that region should meet and decide and think of what would enhance the value of that region, what kind of projects. And perhaps your executive order really should be marching orders for a rational assessment of infrastructure needs rather than say, okay, we're going to do this, this, and this, which is all well and good, but without a thematic tie together, it seems to me to be just hit and miss.
No, that's great. I'm glad you brought that insight in.
Anything else you'd like to discuss of interest to our viewers as far as something that would catch their attention, extol the virtues of Georgism, and certainly help and protect the environment? Is there any other big picture thing in the offing in your world?
Well, I guess the one thing I wanted to mention was a response to an article in the Wall Street Journal by a member of the Cato Institute back in June. We do have a reply. We're trying to get it published in the Wall Street Journal, but one of the things I think
I read the reply. It's an excellent reply, by the way.
I'm sorry.
It's an excellent reply.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate that. But one of the things I see problematic in terms of Georgism is that we have people that think they know what George said, but in fact they don't, and they're using it for their own political purpose or point of view. And we've got this great opportunity now with this discussion about free trade and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, for example, and even have China talking about what free trade means to them. So the whole phrase has taken on new meaning depending on the era you talk about or where you're geographically. One of the things that is meant by Henry George in the free trade argument is that there's a precondition that there's land value capture.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
Yeah, and so if you don't grab that concept, then no matter what you say about what George had opinion on, really off base, and that's essentially our critique of Jim Powell's critique. Well, actually, his mentor was Milton Friedman, and I guess Milton Friedman's favorite book was Henry George's Free Trade or Protectionism, and so I like to discuss that and promote this idea, and I'm thinking that I might be able to get some open ears and when I talk about infrastructure, because this is a perfect angle to talk about George's thought, because where does this land value capture go? Mm-hmm. It goes to the public services that increase the value. That it's like a virtuous circle, and so that's really that going back to when I joined the Georgist organization in 2010. It was like the missing link in the thought processes that I had, because I taught a course at Tulane University when I lived in New Orleans, and I taught a course in public infrastructure, and never really addressed where the money is going to come from. And then when I came here to New York City, there it was, the answer to that question that I hadn't addressed. There is another activity that I'm involved in, and that's low-income housing in Manhattan, for example. I'm involved in a project to provide affordable housing in East Harlem, and I'm really kind of excited about it. We're not really sure whether our proposal is going to be selected, but we're looking at a mechanism so that that we can essentially cross subsidize making homes available. I think we're around 402 homes that we're trying to develop with the commercial that's going to be on the first or second floor. So we see that as a virtuous way of combining real estate and housing for the housing for the people that are essentially being pushed out by this runaway real estate business in Manhattan. I find it kind of funny that we've got a situation where everybody's with money flocking to Manhattan, and sooner or later we're going to be looking around looking for that reason why they came to Manhattan, with whether it's restaurants or events or nature, and going to get to the point where it's just people who are all the same looking for the same thing that's not there anymore. There's so many mom and pop restaurants, for example, that are being pushed out because of the high rents and stuff. So I'm kind of excited about being involved in this group because we see an opportunity to put a little bit of halt or maybe a break on that process. Because it'd be one thing if these billion-dollar, or I don't know about billion, but let's say multi-million-dollar per unit high-rises that go up in Manhattan, if that value would be successfully captured, that'd be one thing. But just to have it so that one large building causes the next building to change their economic game plan and decide to move everybody out and let's put up our high rise for multi-billionaires that need to park their money someplace. There always has to be a reason for why we allow things to happen. And I think it can't be let's be friends of people with money. I think we always have to be aware of there's public services that are needed. So how are we going to provide the public services?
Jane Jacobs would be proud of you.
Yeah, I'm very familiar. That's material for a whole nother talk if you want to about Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs.
Absolutely. All right, well, we're going to wrap this one up, Marty, and thanks for joining us. We always want to keep track of the projects that you seem to be developing at a pretty rapid clip. And next interview we'll have will be on hopefully one of the projects, perhaps the white paper, that gets implemented, and then we can talk about what happened, who was influenced, and how they thought about it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. And if I run into somebody in Washington D.C. and they ask me, I'll say I'd like to be administrator of EPA, and maybe that would be a springboard for something.
Okay. That's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and past episodes, please go to our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Andrew Mazzone, and thank you for watching Smart Talk.